I'm Maya Hayaka. Our Money Daily starts right now. After more than 2 years since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, economies across the world are still dealing with the lingering effects. Several African countries have been seeking to increase funds to support resilience and the post-COVID-19 inclusive economic recovery, like Namibia, which has just received a $135 million loan from the African Development Bank for their Phase 2 post-COVID-19 economic recovery support program. There's been a lot of debate and scrutiny over whether the funds are being spent appropriately. A new report from the Financial Transparency Coalition, FTC, analyzing how countries spent COVID-19 funds, found that only 37% of COVID-19 recovery funds went to urgent social protection measures. Women received less than half as much as men, increasing gender inequality, and there was almost no help for informal workers. The FTC estimates up to 95 million people are expected to be pushed into extreme poverty this year alone due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the cost of living crisis spurred by the Ukraine war. They're calling for cutting austerity measures and replacing them with people-centered economic measures ahead of the IMF and World Bank meetings set to take place in a week's time. So earlier on, I had a chat with Ishmael Zulu, Policy Officer at the Tax Justice Network Africa, and I asked him how the allocation of COVID-19 funds have contributed to the economic crisis many countries are facing today.
Look at the adequacy of our response as a continent. A report shows that only 2.4% of our GDP as low-income countries was spent in comparison to 28.4% for the high-income countries. A large amount was targeted towards the corporate, amounting to about 38% in total. Now, a lack of adequate targeting in recovery spending leaves vulnerable groups in a worse off position, especially those that do not have the funds necessary to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. So it really brings about numerous concerns in terms of how we are going to recover as a continent.
Millions of people are expected to be pushed into extreme poverty this year, especially with the reduction of social stimulus packages. Governments are also running out of cash. What policies do you think they should consider for post-COVID recovery?
So one, government should scale up windfall taxes, wealth taxes, targeting those with high incomes and channeling these funds to financing the recovery as a continent. We have seen that we've seen the growth in billionaires across the African continent itself. So better targeting them in taxes would help fund the recovery. Countries within Africa should support the African Union in calling for a tax body under the United Nations. This would make it more inclusive when it comes to changing the global financial framework in terms of taxation. And then thirdly, there's need to strengthen social protection systems as soon as possible. And lastly, international financial institutions such as the IMF, such as the World Bank, should not impose austerity conditions because this can be very, very regressive in terms of protecting the poor and the vulnerable.
It's interesting that some of these recommendations you've just mentioned are up for discussion in the meetings between IMF and World Bank in the next 1 week. What can we expect in the coming months?
Countries require resources to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, to deal with the impacts of climate change, to deal with the impact of the conflict that has taken place in Ukraine. But then countries are now faced with austerity conditions. There's a new wave of austerity, and I think this is something that countries must speak against strongly. One, country should be able to raise resources domestically to fund their recovery, but then at the same time, when institutions such as the World Bank and IMF provide them with resources, they shouldn't be met with austerity conditions, which limits how governments can target their beneficiaries.